the breath of life, the creation of Adam and Eve in the beginning. The earth was formless, a vast expanse cloaked in silence. Darkness hovered over the deep, yet something stirred, a presence, a purpose waiting to emerge. Then came light, not from sun or moon, but from the Word itself. Mountains rose, rivers carved their way through valleys, stars took their places like watchful eyes above. From the dust of the ground, shaped with intention and care, a body formed. Lifeless clay, transformed by a breath not of wind but of spirit. Adam's chest rose. He opened his eyes and beheld a world untouched by death, a creation made for communion. Trees stretched skyward, fruit ripe for joy. Animals moved freely, unafraid. Yet something was missing. Adam named each creature, watched them move in pairs, heard the sounds of life echo through Eden, but knew he was alone. Not lonely in the sense of sadness, but in the realization that none shared his essence. So, while he slept, a deep rest sent by the one who formed him, a rib was taken, not from his head to rule over, nor his feet to be trampled, but from his side, near his heart. When he awoke, there she stood, Eve, not just flesh of his flesh, but the missing piece of his soul. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a completion. He reached for her, not with authority, but with awe. Together, they walked among the wonders of Eden, discovering beauty in every corner. The breeze whispered through the leaves, and each sunrise painted the sky with new glory. They laughed without shame, worked without burden, and rested in the presence of their Creator. No guilt, no fear, only trust. The garden was not merely a home. It was an extension of their unity with God and with each other. They were naked but knew no shame, for their hearts were unclouded, their minds unburdened, their desires pure. Freedom was theirs, not as a trap or a test, but as a gift. At the center of the garden stood two trees. One offered life eternal, the other knowledge of good and evil. They were free to eat from any tree, except one. The restriction was clear, yet gentle, not shouted but spoken with gravity. It was not fear that surrounded the command, but love, the kind that respects choice. The Creator did not wall off temptation, but placed it in plain view. Not to trick, but to trust. In the freedom, to choose true relationship could exist. Without that, obedience would mean nothing. Love without freedom is control. Freedom without boundaries is chaos. Adam and Eve thrived day after day in this rhythm of work, rest, love, and discovery. Animals responded to their voices. The soil welcomed their touch. The garden was not static. It grew, pulsed, and responded to their stewardship. They were not just visitors. They were co-creators, partners in a sacred dance with the divine. Time was not counted in days or years, but in moments of wonder. Each breath was a reminder of the one who breathed into them. And though they knew the boundary placed before them, they did not yet understand the weight of consequence. In their innocence, they trusted. In their freedom, they remained whole. But in the shadows of the garden, a presence watched. Not evil, in form, but in intent. It waited not with force but with patience. Not with noise but with suggestion. For even in paradise the seed of decision had been planted. A choice that would change everything still lingered, untouched but present. Yet for now the garden sang. Humanity, as it was meant to be, breathed freely. Two hearts, one purpose. Creation smiled. Heaven drew near. The story had begun. Eden in bloom. The garden of delight and divine harmony. Eden was not a garden like any other. It wasn't just trees and streams and sunlight. It was harmony in its purest form, creation in full agreement with its Creator. The rivers that flowed from its heart carried not only water but peace. The soil responded as if it knew the hands that touched it. Flowers bloomed without seasons, and fruit ripened without labor. Colors shimmered with a vibrance untouched by decay. Sounds of life echoed in perfect melody. Birds calling, wind whispering, beasts roaming, each playing its part in a song of praise. This wasn't wilderness. It was order. It was beauty with intention. Adam and Eve lived in the center of this living masterpiece. They had no need to search for purpose. It surrounded them. Every sunrise was a beginning, every sunset a benediction. There was no division between spirit and body, work and worship. Their labor was not toil but participation. Naming animals was not just a task, it was intimacy. Tending the garden was not survival, it was co-creation. When Adam dug his hands into the soil, it was an act of joy. When Eve walked beneath the trees, she moved in communion with the divine. They didn't chase meaning. It flowed to them like the river Pishon over golden stones. They knew God not as a distant force, but as a familiar presence. His voice was not thunder, but a gentle call in the cool of the day. He walked with them, spoke with them, not through mystery, but through presence. There was no temple, for Eden was the holy place. Worship had no liturgy. It was life. Every breath, every glance, every movement was sacred. The Creator delighted not only in the world he had made, but in being known by the ones made in his image. There was no fear in this knowing, no hiding, no shame, only transparency, love, and trust. Heaven and earth touched in Eden. The invisible became visible. The garden's trees stretched with abundance, but two stood apart. The tree of life shimmered with mystery. Its fruit carried eternity in its skin. Eating it wasn't forbidden, yet Adam and Eve never reached for it. They needed no promise of immortality. They lived it every day. The second tree, however, held a warning, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Its name alone hinted at weight beyond understanding. They passed it often, close enough to touch, yet untouched. Not because they were afraid, but because they trusted. The boundary was clear, and it was enough. Love drew them toward obedience, not fear. They lived in freedom, and that freedom was framed by one choice. Eve would walk through the garden and see her reflection in the still waters. She would laugh with Adam beneath the canopy of fig trees. They would rest in each other's arms and watch the stars appear one by one, naked, yet never exposed. There was no shame in their bodies, no insecurity, no measure of worth by beauty or strength. They were whole, complete, and unified. Adam did not rule her. Eve did not resist him. There was no battle for power, only partnership. Two bearers of the same image entrusted with the same mission, to reflect God to creation and care for what had been given. The animals gathered around them without fear. Lions lay beside deer. Snakes moved silently through the grass without threat. Even the serpent in those early days held no malice. All things existed in their rightful place under the order of love. Rain had never fallen. The land was nourished from beneath. Pain had never visited. Tears had never formed. Death was unknown. Eden pulsed with innocence, not ignorance, but peace unmarred by suspicion. They did not question goodness, for they lived within it. But still, the tree remained, and with it, the whisper of possibility. Not allowed temptation, not yet. Just the awareness that something had been withheld, a mystery named but unexplained. In the freedom to love was the risk to choose otherwise. And the serpent, subtle in his weight, knew that one day the question would rise. Not from anger, not from rebellion, but from curiosity, twisted just enough to shift trust into doubt. For now, however, Eden remained pure, and Adam and Eve remained at peace. The garden reflected what their hearts carried: unity, joy, and unbroken relationship. Nature and humanity danced in rhythm. The world was not a resource to be exploited, but a friend to be cared for. The earth responded not to dominance, but to stewardship. Fruit gave itself freely. Trees offered shade without reserve. Even the wind bent around their steps as if it recognized who they were. Dominion was not control. It was responsibility wrapped in love. The garden was a mirror of the Creator's heart, and Adam and Eve were its reflection. But a moment would come when that mirror would crack. Not because they were evil, not because they sought destruction, but because desire, once redirected, could distort. Because the same freedom that made love possible would also make disobedience real. And once the door of doubt opened, even slightly, Eden would never be the same. Yet, until that day, the garden remained in bloom. The harmony remained whole, and the hearts of humanity beat in time with the very heart of God. The whispering shadow, the subtle approach of temptation. The garden still shimmered with light, but in the shadow of its beauty, something began to shift. Not in the trees or rivers, not in the skies or soil, but in the unseen. A presence lingered where innocence was unguarded, not loud, not violent. It moved with silence, with patience. It waited not in darkness but near the light, near the place where boundaries had been gently laid. It did not rage against the Creator's command. It questioned it, and it would not tempt with force, but with words. Words that carried just enough truth to sound safe, and just enough distortion to plant a seed of doubt. The serpent was unlike any other creature in Eden. It did not crawl. It moved with elegance, with eyes that held knowledge. It did not strike. It spoke. And it found. Eve alone, not in rebellion, not in defiance, but in simple exploration. She had passed the tree many times, she had never touched it. But on this day the serpent waited, coiled in the branches, voice poised like a blade hidden in silk. Did God really say? The words hung in the air like fog, not an accusation, a question, a gentle tug at the edges of certainty. Eve paused. She had heard the command. She knew it. "We may eat the fruit of any tree," she replied, "except this one. We must not touch it, or we will die." Her answer held truth, but now mixed with an addition, something not said. Touch had never been forbidden, but already the line blurred. The serpent leaned in. "You will not surely die," it whispered. "God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened. You will be like Him, knowing good and evil." And with that the seed was sown, not with threats, with suggestion, not with rebellion, with invitation. Eve looked again. The fruit hadn't changed, but her gaze had. It looked pleasing, desirable, good for food, yes, but now more. It seemed to promise wisdom, insight, something more than what she had been given. She had walked with God. She had known His voice, but now for the first time she considered what it might mean to know for herself, to decide, to take into her own hands what had always come from trust. Freedom, once safe, now trembled with possibility. And the fruit hung still, as if waiting for her hand. She took it, held it. Nothing happened. The world didn't shake. The skies didn't darken. The fruit felt natural. Her fingers closed around it. She ate. The sweetness touched her tongue, but it was not joy she tasted. It was weight. She turned and offered it to Adam, who stood beside her, silent, watching. He took it without question, without resistance. He, too, ate. And in that moment, their eyes opened, but not in clarity, in exposure. They saw their nakedness, not as beauty but as shame, not as intimacy but as vulnerability. The same bodies once held with honor now felt fragile, defenseless. They reached for leaves, not to celebrate, but to hide. Their minds raced, their hearts beat louder. Guilt entered, not as punishment but as presence. And they knew, not just good, but evil. Not as knowledge but as awareness. Their innocence was not taken. It was lost. Given away in exchange for something they could not undo. The serpent vanished. It had done its work. It had not lied. Not fully. Their eyes were opened. But the truth had been wrapped in poison. They had become like God, but only in burden. They now knew what was never meant for them: the weight of choice, the fracture of trust, the fear of consequence. The silence between them and their Creator grew loud. The garden had not changed, but they had. And in that change, Eden could no longer hold them the same way. They heard the voice of God walking in the garden. It was the same sound, the same presence, but now it brought fear. They hid. Among trees that once welcomed them, behind leaves that could not cover what had been done. God called, "Where are you?" Not because he did not know, but because they no longer did. They had lost themselves in the act of grasping for what was never theirs. And now, for the first time, they stood not as image bearers, but as breakers of trust. Adam spoke. "I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid." Fear had entered paradise. Shame had corrupted love. God asked, "Have you eaten from the tree?" Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. The circle of trust shattered, and though judgment had not yet fallen, the fracture was complete. Relationships once seamless were now tangled with defense. Love had not died, but it had been wounded. Yet even here, in the whispering shadow of failure, a promise would begin to take form. The serpent would not have the final word. The exile would not be the end. The pain would not be the last echo. But for now the garden fell silent, and the first humans, once crowned with innocence, now bore the weight of a freedom misused. Eden waited, and the earth held its breath. The choice that echoes. The moment. Everything changed. The silence after the bite was louder than thunder. Nothing exploded, no fire fell from the sky, yet everything had shifted. Adam and Eve stood in a world that looked the same, but felt entirely different. The trees still swayed, the river still ran, the fruit still glistened, but the peace was gone. The invisible harmony, once their covering, had been torn away. They were exposed, not just in body, but in soul. The garden had not moved, God had not changed, but their hearts no longer aligned with his voice. The freedom they had embraced now felt like a chain. God's voice walked in the garden again. A sound they once welcomed now sent them scrambling for cover. Adam, who had stood tall naming creatures, now crouched behind branches. Eve, once radiant in innocence, now shivered beneath leaves. They did not understand death, but they felt its shadow. Not as an end, but as a separation, a wall invisible, yet real. When God asked, "Where are you?" it wasn't geography, he questioned. It was relationship. He called them not to accuse, but to invite confession. Yet their first words were not sorrow, but blame. Adam pointed to Eve. "The woman you gave me." His voice held a subtle shift, not just toward her, but toward God himself. As if the gift had become a trap. As if love had become a liability. Eve followed the same pattern. "The serpent deceived me." Neither took ownership. Both recoiled, in the instinct to protect self over truth. The unity they once shared now fractured into isolation. Shame built walls, fear closed hearts. The seed of rebellion bore fruit, not just in disobedience, but in brokenness. God turned first to the serpent. He did not ask questions. He declared consequences. A curse, not just on the creature, but on the force it embodied. Crawling, humiliation, enmity. But hidden within the judgment, a whisper of hope. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. A promise, veiled in poetry, of a battle yet to come. Of a seed from the woman who would reverse what was done. The first prophecy. The first thread of redemption woven into judgment. Even in justice, mercy prepared a way. To Eve, God spoke of pain, particularly in childbirth. Not as punishment, but as consequence. Life would now come through struggle. Relationship with her husband, once a partnership of equals, would now feel the tension of domination and desire. Trust had broken, and even love would bear the scars. To Adam, the ground itself would respond in resistance. Work would remain, but joy would be laced with sweat. The earth, once partner, would now be a battleground. Thorns would rise where flowers once bloomed. The dust from which he came would one day reclaim him. Then came the exile. Not out of cruelty, but out of protection. For if Adam and Eve, in their fallen state, reached for the tree of life, they would live forever in separation. Mercy guarded the garden's gates. A flaming sword, a cherubim, symbols not of wrath but of grace drawing a line. The way back to Eden would now require more than footsteps. It would require redemption. The garden remained, but humanity stepped beyond its borders. East of Eden, history began. God did not abandon them. He clothed them, not with leaves, but with garments made from skin. Blood had been shed, an innocent life taken to cover shame, the first sacrifice, the first sign that sin could not be hidden. It must be covered, not with effort, with provision. Even in failure, God moved toward them. Love did not vanish. It adapted, it followed, it endured. Adam named Eve again, not in blame, but in hope. Mother of all living. A name that spoke forward, not backward. Despite exile, life would continue, and so they walked. Out of the garden, into a world now touched by loss. Eden was behind them, but not erased. It remained in memory, in ache, in longing. A paradise they could no longer touch but could not forget. Their story would be told and retold, not just as a warning, but as a beginning. For though the fall had come, so had the promise. The serpent had spoken, but so had God, and his word would endure. The choice made in Eden would echo through generations. It would shape every tear, every war, every betrayal. But it would also set the stage for rescue, for the day when another would face temptation, not in a garden of beauty, but in a wilderness of dust, and choose differently. Until then, humanity would live between memory and hope, carrying both the wound and the whisper, that the story was not over, that the gate may be closed but not forever. East of Eden, a world touched by loss. The earth outside Eden was wide, unfamiliar, and quiet in a different way. The silence here did not sing with peace, it echoed with absence. Adam and Eve had walked out of the garden not in rebellion but in grief. Their feet touched soil that once welcomed them. Now it resisted. The same ground that birthed flowers now bore thorns. The breeze that once carried the voice of God now passed through with no reply. The world had not ended, but innocence had, and that loss touched everything. Life continued, but it was no longer simple. Work became labor. Food, once freely given, now required sweat and struggle. Adam pressed his hands into the earth and felt it push back. Eve, with new life stirring in her body, felt the promise of motherhood mingled with the reality of pain. What had once been effortless now demanded strength. What had once been joy now moved through sorrow. Yet even here in the broken soil, grace remained. Their lives were not cursed to ruin, but marked by reality. Cain was born. Then Abel. 2 sons, 2 paths, both carrying the legacy of freedom and choice. In their eyes, Adam and Eve saw the future and the consequence. The knowledge of good and evil had not vanished. It had taken root, and soon it would bloom. The first conflict between brothers rose not from survival, but from worship. Cain's offering came from the land, but his heart held pride. Abel's offering came with faith, a posture of trust. When God favored Abel, Cain's face fell, and the fracture that began in the garden split deeper. Cain spoke to Abel in the field. No witnesses, no noise, just a moment. And then blood cried from the ground. The first death, not from age, not from disease, from choice, from anger, from sin that crouched at the door and was not resisted. Eve, who once tasted fruit with trembling hands, now held the body of her son, one gone to exile, the other to the grave. The cost of knowing echoed through her bones. She had not imagined this. Adam stood silent beside her. No words, no answer. Just the weight of what had begun. But even in exile, God did not withdraw. He marked Cain, not to curse, but to protect. Mercy again stretched further than judgment. Even the guilty were not forgotten. The story, though wounded, would not be abandoned. Seth was born, another seed, another hope. Eve named him not with despair, but with faith. God has granted me another child. The promise lived on, not in perfect sons, but in continued life. A thread of redemption still unbroken. Generations passed. Humanity grew. Cities rose. Culture formed. Music, tools, language, all emerging from minds still bearing the image of God. But so did corruption, violence, greed, pride. The knowledge of evil did not remain theoretical. It took shape in systems, in nations, in families. And yet, so did goodness. So did beauty. Love still bloomed even in exile. Laughter still echoed, even in pain. Weddings, harvests, births, each moment of joy a defiant reminder that the story was not beyond redemption. The longing for Eden did not fade. It lived in every story told by firelight, in every prayer whispered toward the heavens. Humanity remembered paradise, not with clarity, but with ache. A sense that something had been lost, that something greater had once held them. And though the gate remained closed, the desire to return burned in every heart. Religion was born, not from manipulation, but from memory. A reaching back. A search for the voice that once walked with them in the cool of the day. Sacrifices were made. Altars built, towers raised, some out of worship, others out of ambition. The line between desire for God and desire to be God blurred again and again, and still the Creator watched, not with wrath alone, but with sorrow and patience. He had not walked away. He waited. He called prophets. He stirred dreams. He planted promises. From the line of Seth, a people would rise. A covenant would form. A rescue would unfold, not to return to Eden as it was, but to move toward something even greater. Adam lived long. He saw his children's children, but the joy was always mixed. His hands, once lifted in praise, now built shelter from storms. His heart, once whole, carried the ache of memory. He died, not with despair, but with hope, knowing that the God who had clothed him still watched over the line he left behind. Eve, too, faded with time, but her name endured. The mother of all living, the first to fall, the first to grieve, and yet the first to hope again. The world east of Eden was not paradise, but it was not forsaken. It became the canvas for redemption, a place where brokenness revealed the depth of love, where pain became the stage for promise, where humanity, though fallen, could still reflect the Creator's heart. The choice made in Eden still echoed, but so did the voice of God, calling, waiting, moving toward a garden once lost, and a restoration yet to come. The long return. From the garden to redemption time moved forward and Eden remained behind, a sealed garden, untouched, untrodden, remembered only in whispers and dreams. But the story it began did not end at its gates. From the moment Adam and Eve stepped out into the dust, a quiet rhythm began pulsing through the human timeline, one not marked by perfection but by promise, a thread that would not break no matter how far humanity wandered. Though paradise was lost, hope was never fully silenced. The long return had begun, not by human will, but by divine mercy. Generations that followed were born into a fractured world. Each carried the image of God, but also the weight of that ancient rupture. People loved, but also betrayed. They built, but also destroyed. Some sought justice, others craved power. The knowledge of good and evil pulsed in every heart. Some obeyed the quiet tug of conscience. Others, silenced it. The freedom to choose remained, and with it came both glory and grief. Yet through it all, God did not forget. He called out to Noah in a time when the earth was drenched in violence. He called out to Abraham in a world of idols and altars. He whispered to prophets, walked with kings, and wept with the broken. Each moment in the story pointed beyond itself toward something greater. The exile from Eden had not erased God's intention. It had unveiled the depth of his desire, not to merely restore a place, but to reclaim hearts. The goal was not just to go back, but to become new. Throughout history, people tried to build their own way back to the garden. Towers were raised, laws were written, rituals were created, some genuine, others desperate, but none could bridge the distance. The wound in the soul of humanity was too deep to heal by human effort. The ache for Eden could not be solved with more knowledge, more strength, or more sacrifice. What had been broken by pride could only be restored through surrender. And then, in the fullness of time, the whisper of hope became flesh. A child was born, not in a palace, but in poverty, not in Eden, but in a stable. Jesus stepped into the dust of exile not to condemn, but to redeem. He came not to show a better way of living, but to be the way. In his words, people heard echoes of that first voice in the garden. In his touch, they felt the compassion of the Creator. He healed the sick, restored the broken, forgave the guilty. But more than that, he faced the same temptation. In a wilderness, not unlike Eden but without its beauty, he met the serpent, not in the form of a creature but in words. Again came the voice, "If you are the Son of God." Again came the offer of power, of pride, of disobedience masked as freedom. But this time, the story changed. Jesus chose surrender, chose trust, chose the voice of the Father over the whisper of ambition. And where Adam fell, he stood. Where Eve reached, he resisted. And the echo of Eden cracked, but redemption would cost more than obedience. It would require sacrifice. On a cross, thorns crowned his head, symbols of the cursed ground. His hand stretched wide, not to take forbidden fruit, but to give his life. The tree of death became a tree of life. His blood became the covering, not like the skins God gave Adam and Eve, but something deeper, final, eternal. In him, shame was covered, guilt removed. The way back opened. The curtain in the temple tore. The barrier between God and humanity was shattered, not by might, but by mercy. And now, anyone, anywhere, can begin the journey home. Not to Eden as it was, but to a kingdom where God walks again with his people. A place not marked by innocence but by redemption. Not untouched by pain, but restored through it. Jesus became the new Adam, the firstborn of a new creation. And in him, the story finds its turning point. But we still live east of Eden. The world still bears scars. The ground still groans. The heart still struggles. Yet we walk with a map now, written not on paper but in grace. We know the way. We know the one who made it. And every act of love, every step of faith, every moment of forgiveness brings the garden closer. One day there will be a new heaven and a new earth. One day the tree of life will rise again, not guarded, but offered freely. Its leaves will heal nations. Its fruit will satisfy souls. Until then, the story continues. From the dust of Adam to the glory of resurrection, the journey of humanity unfolds, not as a tale of failure, but of longing met by love. We are not just people who fell. We are people being found. The beginning was beauty. The middle, brokenness. But the end is redemption, and beyond that, something even Eden could not contain.